On a Wednesday morning in the third week of March, 2003, Eunice Tamblyn stood in the gravel lot behind Tamblyn Feed and Seed on the south end of Millhaven, Kansas, and watched the last co-op truck pull away from her loading dock with an order that was exactly half the size of what it had been the previous spring. She stood there long enough that the cold got into her jacket, and she didn't move to button it. The truck turned left onto County Road 18 and disappeared behind the tree line, and Eunice did the arithmetic in her head the way she'd been doing it for 6 months without writing it down, because writing it down made it real in a way she wasn't ready for yet. The math said she had maybe one more season before she'd have to make the kind of decisions her father had made in 1981, and he'd gotten them wrong, and the business had taken 4 years to recover. She knew this because she'd been 14 in 1981 and had watched him make them. If you know anything about what was happening to independent seed and feed dealers in the Central Plains in 2003, you already understand the shape of what Eunice was facing. The consolidation had been moving through the industry the way a slow fire moves through dry grass. Not fast enough to be dramatic, but steady enough that by the time you smelled smoke, you were already inside it. The big regional distributors had been buying out independent dealers for the better part of a decade, and the ones they hadn't bought out, they'd undercut. They had distribution networks and storage capacity and fleet discounts that a single county operation couldn't match. They had agronomists on staff and computerized soil programs and GPS mapping services bundled into their sales pitch. They had polo shirts with logos and laminated brochures that Eunice could not have afforded to print. What Eunice Tamblyn had was a gray cinder block, building her grandfather had built in 1947, a seed cooler that needed a new compressor, 1,200 square feet of storage that smelled like burlap and mineral oil, and 22 years of knowing every farm within 40 miles of Millhaven the way a doctor knows a patient she has been treating since childhood. She had taken over from her father in 1991 when his diabetes made the heavy work impossible. She'd kept the name because the name was older than both of them, and because changing it would have cost money she needed for other things, and because when old Gus Tamblyn had built that cinder block building in 1947, he had built something that was supposed to outlast him. And Eunice intended to make sure it did. She sold seed corn and sorghum and alfalfa and winter wheat. She sold fertilizer and herbicide in quantities that the big distributors found too small to bother with. She mixed custom feed rations for cattle and hogs and the occasional small dairy operation. She had a man named Corbin Sheets who drove deliveries and ran the forklift, and a woman named June Palak who had done the books for 9 years, and a kid named Dustin who swept floors and learned things whether or not he knew he was learning them. In March of 2003, she was trying to figure out how to keep all 3 of them working through the summer when her largest customer had just cut his order in half. Let me tell you about Eunice's largest customer, because understanding him is the only way to understand what happened next. His name was Warren Blatchett, and he farmed 4,800 acres in 3 counties, which made him by any reasonable measure the largest single operation in the region. He'd been buying from Tamblyn Feed and Seed since before Eunice's father handed her the keys. He'd bought from Gus Tamblyn when Warren was a young man and Gus was old, and it was the kind of commercial relationship that had been built on handshakes and familiarity and the specific trust that comes from someone knowing your soil and your operation and your family's history with both. Warren Blatchett had not left Tamblyn's. He had simply begun splitting his orders, half from her, half from a regional distributor called Prairie Summit out of Wichita, which had opened a service center in Dodge City the previous fall and was aggressively pricing to take market share. Warren was a practical man, not a cruel one. He told Eunice, directly that he wasn't leaving. He was just spreading his exposure. That was the word he used. Exposure. When Warren Blatchett split his orders, other people followed. Not because they were told to, but because in a county where everybody knew what everybody else was doing, the news that Warren Blatchett was hedging was itself a kind of signal. 3 smaller operations made the same call within 6 weeks. Eunice had seen it happen before. Not to her, but to others. She'd watched 2 feed dealers close in Ford County in the previous 4 years. She knew the sequence. You didn't close all at once. You thinned. A customer here, a contract there, until one morning you were doing the arithmetic in a gravel lot with your jacket open in March, and the numbers were not going the way they needed to go. She'd made calls. She'd dropped her price on soybean seed to match Prairie Summit's promotional rate. She'd bought a new soil sampling kit and started offering free analysis to any farmer who asked. She'd driven out to farms she hadn't visited in 2 years, sat at kitchen tables, drank coffee she didn't want, listened to people talk about their operations, because listening was something she was good at, and it cost nothing except time. None of it had materially changed the direction of things. That Wednesday morning in March, after the co-op truck disappeared, Eunice went inside and made herself a cup of coffee and sat down at the desk her grandfather had built from 2x12s and told herself the thing she'd been avoiding. She needed something different. She did not know yet what different meant. She only knew that what she was doing wasn't working, and that doing more of the same thing more aggressively was not going to produce a different result. She was sitting there with her coffee cooling when Corvin Sheets came in from the back and said there was someone in the lot asking for her. Let me tell you about Maribeth Solon, because she is the person this story turns on, even though she didn't know it yet, and Eunice didn't know it yet, and nobody in Millhaven, Kansas would have predicted it if you'd asked them that morning. Maribeth Solon was 53 years old and had farmed the same ground her family had owned since 1929, 620 acres in the bottomland south of the Arkansas River that her grandmother had managed through the Dust Bowl by methods that most people in 2003 would have considered eccentric at best. Her grandmother had kept the soil alive during the worst years not through any commercial input, but through a set of practices she'd learned from her own mother and adapted over 40 years of working that specific ground. Maribeth knew these practices the way you know something you grew up watching, not theoretically. In her hands, she had a problem that spring that was not a mechanical problem, and not a pest problem, and not a financing problem, though she had versions of all 3 in the background the way every farmer does. Her problem was that a section of her bottomland that had been among her most productive ground for 30 years had, over the past 2 seasons, begun producing yields that were 15% below what the soil tests said it should be producing. She'd had the soil tested 3 times. She'd consulted with the extension office. She'd spoken to an agronomist from Prairie Summit when they'd come through doing their sales pitch. The agronomist had given her a printed program and recommended a phosphorus amendment and a new hybrid with stronger root architecture. She'd followed the program. The yields had gone down another 4%. She came to Eunice Tamblin not because she expected Eunice to know what the Prairie Summit agronomist didn't know. She came because she was out of institutional options, and Eunice had known her family for a long time. And sometimes when you've run out of technical answers, you go back to the person who knew your land before it became a data point in someone's regional program. Eunice listened to her. That was the first thing. She listened without taking notes and without looking at a screen and without asking the kind of questions that are really just ways of steering someone toward an answer you've already decided on. She listened the way she'd always listened, which was with the full weight of her attention, and without any particular place she needed the conversation to go. And then she said something that Maribeth had not expected. She said, "Tell me about your grandmother's methods." Maribeth looked at her. She said she wasn't sure what that had to do with a yield problem in 2003. Eunice said, "Tell me anyway." "Let me tell you about what was in the back room of Tamblyn Feed and Seed, because this is the part of the story that matters, and also the part that most people who came through the front door never knew existed. Behind the main storage area, past the seed cooler and the fertilizer racks, through a door that was usually closed and that had a handle worn smooth from 40 years of use, there was a room that Eunice's grandfather had built as an office, and that her father had used for the same purpose, and that Eunice had converted, slowly and without any announcement, into something that had no real name in the commercial agriculture world of 2003. It was part library, part seed vault, part field record archive. The shelves along the north wall held 60 years of field ledgers in her grandfather's handwriting, her father's handwriting, and her own. Not digital records. Paper. The kind of record that showed not just what was planted and what it yielded, but what the weather had done, what the ground had shown, what decisions had been made and why, and what had happened afterward. 60 years of a specific understanding of specific ground in a specific county in central Kansas. The shelves along the east wall held seeds, not the commercial varieties that sat in the bins out front, older varieties. Open-pollinated corn that her grandfather had grown through the 1940s and 1950s before the hybrids took over. Sorghum varieties that had been developed by small breeders and then abandoned when the seed companies consolidated. A winter wheat her grandmother's neighbor had maintained for 30 years that nobody grew commercially anymore because it yielded 8% less per acre than the current certified varieties, but that had characteristics in wet springs that the current varieties didn't have. Eunice had been maintaining these seeds for 20 years. Not because anyone asked her to, not because they were profitable, because her father had maintained them before her and had told her, simply, that you didn't throw away something that worked just because something else was newer. Most of the farmers who came through Tamblyn Feed and Seed never saw that room. Some who did saw an old woman's hobby and were polite about it. A few had asked about specific varieties, and Eunice had told them what she knew, and sometimes the conversation went somewhere useful, and sometimes it didn't. She had never advertised it. She'd never thought of it as a business asset. She thought of it the way her father had thought of it, as the obligation that comes with knowing something other people have stopped paying attention to. She took Maribeth into that room and showed her the field ledgers. They spent 2 hours going through records that documented that specific bottomland section going back to 1961, when Maribeth's own father had first sold to Gus Tamblyn, and Gus had started keeping notes on what was planted there and how it performed. And what those records showed, when you looked at them together across 60 years of data, was something that neither a soil test nor an agronomist's printed program had been designed to find. The section in question sat at the low point of a natural drainage pattern. In most years, this meant it held moisture longer and produced better than the surrounding ground. But in years when the previous autumn had been dry, the soil structure in that section behaved differently. The capillary channels that moved water up through the profile in normal years collapsed slightly when they dried too quickly, and when they collapsed, the roots of whatever was planted there couldn't access the water that was sitting 12 inches deeper than they should have been able to reach. The soil test showed adequate moisture and adequate nutrients. The roots couldn't get to either one. The yield dropped. The commercial fix, which was to add more of what the test said was deficient, didn't work because deficiency wasn't the problem. Maribeth's grandmother had known this, not scientifically, but practically, and what the ledgers showed was that in years when that section underperformed, her grandmother had planted a different variety in it. The open-pollinated corn on Eunice's east wall shelf, the one her grandfather had grown through the 1940s and 50s, had a root architecture that was aggressive enough in adverse conditions to push through compacted capillary zones that the modern hybrids, bred for optimal conditions, weren't designed to handle. It was not the newest solution. The newest solution was the one the Prairie Summit agronomist had recommended, and it had made things worse. It was the right solution for the specific problem in front of them. Maribeth stood in that back room for a long moment after Eunice showed her the records. She didn't say anything right away. She looked at the ledger pages, and she looked at the seed jars on the shelf, and she looked at Eunice with an expression that was part recognition and part something harder to name. The particular look of someone who has been searching for an answer in the wrong place and has just been shown where it actually was. She said, "My grandmother used to say there was no substitute for knowing your own ground." Eunice said, "Your grandmother was right. Let me tell you what happened that spring, because the spring of 2003 is when things began to move in a direction that no agricultural consultant and no regional distributor and no trade publication would have predicted or recommended. Maribeth planted the old variety in the problem section, 40 acres of it, which was all she was willing to risk that first year. She planted it according to a protocol that Eunice reconstructed from the ledger records, spaced differently than the modern recommendations, with no phosphorus amendment, because the record suggested that adding phosphorus to that specific soil structure in that specific condition made the problem worse rather than better. The neighboring farmers noticed, not because she told them, but because farmers notice what other farmers do, and when Maribeth Solon, who had farmed that ground for 30 years, changed her planting in a section, everyone knew had been underperforming, people paid attention. Her neighbor to the north, a man named Glenn Probst, stopped his truck on the county road in late May and watched the field for a while, and then drove into Maribeth's yard and asked what she'd planted and why. She told him about Eunice's back room. Glenn Probst had a similar situation on his own operation, a section of sandy ground that had been losing productivity for 3 years in a way that the standard recommendations hadn't addressed. He drove to Tamblin Feed and Seed and asked to see the ledgers. Eunice showed him. Then she showed him what was on the east wall. Glenn spent the better part of an afternoon in that back room, and when he left he took 3 things with him. A jar of seed from a sorghum variety that hadn't been commercially available since 1987, a set of photocopied ledger pages going back 15 years on his own family's ground, and a question he hadn't been able to answer before he came in, which now had the shape of an answer. Word moved the way word moves in small counties, not through advertising, not through a press release, through the specific urgent communication of people who have a problem and have just learned that the person with the answer is someone they already knew, in a building they'd been driving past for 30 years. By late May, Eunice had pulled out ledger records for 11 different farms. By June, she had spoken with 22 people about varieties that had not been commercially available for between 8 and 25 years. Not all of them came with a problem. Some came because they'd heard there was something worth looking at, and curiosity was enough. But enough of them came with a problem, and enough of those problems had something in the ledgers and the seed room that bore on them, that the back room of Tamblin Feed and Seed became, without announcement and without design, the most useful agricultural resource in 4 counties. Let me tell you about the conversation Usens had with a man named Travis Bridewell, because it is the conversation that explains everything else. There was Travis Bridewell ran Prairie Summit's Dodge City Service Center. He was a capable man and a straight-dealing one, and he had built their regional market position through genuine service and competitive pricing, and he had done it well enough that Eunice had lost significant business to him over the previous 18 months. He was not the villain of this story. He was the competition doing what competition does. He heard about what was happening at Tamblin's from a customer who mentioned it in passing during a service call, and he drove out to Millhaven in late June specifically to see it for himself. He walked through the front of the shop the way he had a few years earlier when he was sizing up the local competition, and Eunice showed him the back room the same way she'd shown everyone else. He stood in front of the seed shelves for a while. He looked at the ledgers. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "We don't have anything like this." Eunice, she knew. He said, she knew. He said, "These records go back how she far. Grandfather started in 1941. He was quiet again. He was the kind who thought before he spoke, and who said what he meant when he spoke, and what he said next was something Eunice had not been expecting. He said, "I have 7 customers right now with yield problems that my agronomists can't fully explain. I've got 2 of them on their 3rd round of soil amendments with no measurable improvement. I've been telling them it takes time." He paused. "I don't think it just takes time," Eunice said. "Send them to me." He looked at her for a moment. He said, "You know I took your biggest customer." Eunice, "I know. Send them anyway." Travis Bridewell sent them. All 7 came to Tamblin's within 3 weeks, and 4 of them had situations that the ledger records bore directly on, and 2 of those became regular customers of Tamblin Feed and Seed, and 1 of them referred 2 of his neighbors, and the referrals came with the specific endorsement that carries more weight in a small county than any amount of marketing. The endorsement of someone who had tried everything else first. Let me tell you about what happened to Tamblin Feed and Seed in the seasons that followed, because what happened is the reason it is still there today, and the reason Eunice's daughter is learning the back room the same way Eunice learned it, not from a manual but from sitting in it and listening and paying attention to what the records are saying. Warren Blatchett came back in full by the following spring. Not because Eunice asked him to, because he had a section of ground with an old drainage problem that 3 consecutive wet springs had made worse and that the Prairie Summit program had not addressed, and someone had told him about the ledger room, and he drove out to see it on a Tuesday morning in February and spent 4 hours with Eunice going through records that his own family's land had contributed to since 1962. He sat across from her at her grandfather's 2x12 desk, and he said, "Why didn't you ever tell me about this room?" Eunice said, "You never asked about this room. You asked about price on soybean seed." Warren Blatchett was not a man who apologized easily, but he nodded in a way that meant the same thing. The seed varieties in the back room became, over the following years, something that Eunice thought of carefully and managed deliberately. Not a commercial product, not a brand. Something more specific than that. The knowledge of which variety worked in which conditions on which ground. Knowledge that lived in the ledgers and in Eunice's head and that could not be downloaded from a database or provided by a regional service center, regardless of how many agronomists they had on staff. Prairie Summit could offer scale. They could offer logistics. They could offer stir optimally in standard varieties bred to perform optimally standard. What they could not offer was 60 years of records on the specific behavior of specific ground in a specific county, maintained by 3 generations of people who had thought it was worth keeping. Eunice did not advertise that distinction. She didn't have to. Corvin Sheets stopped driving the forklift as much and started driving to farms more because the deliveries were being joined to conversations that required someone who knew the operation's history. June Palak started keeping a new set of records alongside the financial books, field notes that Eunice dictated at the end of each consultation, because the consultations had become frequent enough and detailed enough that memory alone wasn't sufficient anymore. Dustin, who had been sweeping floors and learning things without knowing he was learning them, started spending time in the back room on his own initiative. He was 23 and had grown up in Millhaven, and his family had farmed nearby ground for 2 generations, and one afternoon Eunice found him reading a ledger from 1968 with the concentration of someone who had found something they didn't know they were looking for. She asked him what he was reading. He said he was reading about a hail event in the summer of 1968 that had affected the same section his grandfather had told him about. His grandfather had said that section always came back strong after weather damage, faster than the surrounding ground, and Dustin had never understood why. The 1968 ledger had a note his great-grandmother's neighbor had left about that specific section, handwritten at the bottom of the page in pencil that was faded but legible. The note said the section sat over a shallow limestone shelf that retained heat and promoted earlier root recovery after physical damage to the plant structure. Nobody had known that in 2003. Nobody who was farming that ground had thought to ask. Dustin looked up at Eunice and said, "Does my grandfather know about this room?" Eunice said, "Your grandfather helped build 2 of those shelves in 1979. Let me tell you about what Eunice told her daughter, because her daughter is the one who manages the back room now and the one who has added to the ledger record with a consistency that would have made old Gus Tamblyn recognize what he started. Her daughter's name is Phoebe, and she was 12 in 2003, old enough to understand that something was wrong with the business, and old enough to know that her mother was trying to fix it without being frightened in the way only a child can be frightened, which is to say completely and without access to the practical mechanisms that make adult fear productive. She helped in the shop on weekends the way her mother had helped her grandfather, and she watched that spring and summer with the particular attention of someone who understood that what she was watching mattered. What Eunice told her, Phoebe has repeated in different forms over the years to different people, and it goes roughly like this. She said, "The reason that room saved this business is not because old things are better than new things. That is not the lesson. The lesson is that the newest answer is always designed for the most common version of the problem. And the most common version of the problem is not always the problem you have." Your grandfather kept those records because he knew that his customer's ground was not like everyone else's ground. He knew that it had a specific history and a specific character, and that no one who was optimizing for scale could afford to pay attentions to it the way he could. The back room is not a museum. It is the thing we know that no one else took the time to keep knowing. Don't ever let it become a room that people walk past without going in. Phoebe was 12. She understood part of it and not all of it. She understood it better at 25 when she was running the seed side of the operation and a farmer came in with a problem that the extension office couldn't diagnose, and the answer was in a ledger from 1977. She understood it fully by the time she was 35 and had started adding her own records to the archive, not in her grandfather's handwriting or her grandmother's or her mother's, but in her own, with her own observations and her own questions written in the margins in the same pencil that everyone before her had used. The back room of Tamblyn, Feed and Seed is still there. The shelves are fuller than they were in 2003. The ledgers go back further now, because Phoebe tracked down records from a retired dealer in the next county who was about to throw away 40 years of field notes. And those notes covered ground that overlapped with Tamblin's service area and filled in gaps that had existed in the archive for decades. She drove out on a Saturday morning and loaded 6 boxes into her truck and brought them back and spent 3 months cross-referencing them against what they already had. Nobody asked her to do that. Nobody told her it would matter. She did it because her mother had told her something that her grandfather had told her mother, which was that the thing everyone else has stopped paying attention to is usually the most valuable thing in the room, and the only way to know which things those are is to be the kind of person who keeps paying attention after everyone else has moved on. Warren Blatchett's son farms the operation now. He comes into Tamblin's every February for a planning consultation that takes most of the morning, and always ends in the back room with the ledgers. He has never once asked about price first, and on a shelf near the door, in a mason jar labeled in Gus Tamblin's handwriting from sometime in the 1950s, there is still seed from the open-pollinated corn variety that Maribeth Solon planted in her problem section in the spring of 2003, the variety that produced a yield that year that was 11% above what the soil test had predicted was possible in a section of ground that 3 years of commercial recommendations had been making worse. Phoebe keeps it there the way her mother kept it there, and the way Gus kept it there before that. Not because it's the best variety for most conditions, because it's the right variety for a specific condition that comes around often enough to matter, and because the day you stop keeping the thing that the newest answer wasn't designed for is the day you stop being able to help the person whose problem the newest answer isn't solving. That jar has been on that shelf for over 70 years. Phoebe intends to keep it there. She checks the viability every spring and refreshes the seed when she needs to. And she runs a small grow-out plot behind the building where she maintains the varieties that aren't available anywhere else on the same ground where her grandfather grew test plots in the 1950s, in the same soil that has been telling the same story about itself for 100 years to anyone who has taken the time to listen. The Tamblin name is still on the building. The cinder block is the same cinder block. The desk made from 2x12s is still in the back room, and Phoebe sits at it the way her mother sat at it and her grandfather sat at it, working through problems that don't have a standard answer, with records that nobody else thought were worth keeping, and seeds that nobody else thought were worth saving. When new farmers come in, young people who have taken over ground from parents or grandparents and are still learning what they have, Phoebe takes them to the back room. She shows them the ledgers. She finds the records for their land if they exist, and if they don't exist yet, she starts them. She asks the questions that take a long time to answer and writes the answers down, not because it's profitable in the short, because it's the only kind of knowledge that compounds the way good soil compounds, slowly, invisibly across generations, building something that no one can fully see until they look back at it from a distance and realize that everything that grew from it grew from something that someone, a long time ago, decided was worth the trouble of keeping.